Hey everybody, welcome back to week 2 of our series Atypical. Looking forward to diving right into this. Last week we talked about what an atypical family is. We talked about Adam and Eve and the fact that their family was very atypical. But even in their atypical situation, even though they failed God, God still used them and their family line to redeem us today through the life of Jesus. So today we're going to pick back up and we're going to move right along with week 2 of this lesson about atypical families. And, we're talking about the not so normal families that are found in the Bible and the fact that our families are not so normal also, right? So if I were to ask you questions like, how many siblings you have, or maybe how many pets you have, or how many family members, extended family members maybe live in your house. Those answers to those questions would be all over the board. Some of you would say you have one sibling, some of you would say none, some of you might say you've got 4 or 5. Some of you might say you've got multiple pets or no pets. So the answers to these questions may vary very widely. But if I were to ask you this question, when was the last time that you had a disagreement with your family? Or have you ever had a disagreement with your family? I can 100% say that the answers to that question would be, yes, I've had a disagreement with my family because we've all been there. We've all had disagreements with our families. Our families may be different in a lot of different ways, but there's one thing that I know for sure: all our families have disagreements at some point in time. So let's see how you might relate to these different family situations. John and Abigail have always wanted kids, but they've never been able to have them on their own. So they decide to adopt or foster some children. Right now they're fostering a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old. They're having trouble adjusting. These foster kids are having trouble adjusting to their new foster family, and they're often angry and getting in trouble at school. What about this one? Joel and Anna divorced 3 years ago. They have 2 kids together. Last year, both of them remarried to people who also had their own kids. Now their family has grown from 2 parents and 2 kids to 4 parents and 4 kids. The kids don't get along with their step-parents, and they're angry with their parents for not being able to stay together and having to get remarried. Here's another one. A single-parent household. Renee is a single mom with 3 kids and works 2 jobs in order to support her children. Tim is 17, and he works a job to help take care of things around the house, but he also plays the role of father to his younger siblings. Tim is often frustrated by the fact that he has to help parent his siblings instead of simply being a kid. And his siblings don't see Tim as an authority figure because he's really just their brother. And this causes a lot of friction in their family. Here's another one. Max and Jennifer are both very involved in their jobs. Jennifer is often traveling around the world, while Max often works 10 to 15 hours a day. Their 2 kids don't spend much time with their parents. The kids are pretty used to this arrangement by now, and they can take care of themselves, but the distance is causing a strain on the relationship with their parents. Max and Jennifer want to be able to provide for their kids financially, but they struggle with the thought of leaving their kids alone so often. Both kids miss their parents, but they don't want anyone to know how sad that they really are. They often turn to things like alcohol or playing with stuff that their parents buy them in their absence to occupy their time. And the last one, Rochelle, Maria, and Blake grew up in the same neighborhood. All 3 of them have difficult home lives, and they've always had each other. They have been best friends since they were in diapers and once made a pact that they would always be family no matter what. But things have changed recently. Maria just found out she's being transferred to a new school. Blake got a new girlfriend that's causing him to spend less time with Maria and Rochelle. And all three of them are worried that their friendship family might come to an end. So now that you've had some time to imagine the life of these atypical families, what are some things that you see in common? Think about them. While they're not the typical family dynamic, they are all typical for today's society. They're not your mom and dad and two kids at home and dad's out working and mom's staying at home and taking care of the kids. And these are not your typical families, but it's not what you think of typically as a family, but they're all typical in today's society. And the other thing is they all have issues that they're trying to work out. It doesn't matter what your family situation is. We all have those types of situations that we're trying to work out, that we're trying to figure out. You might even be able to relate directly with one of these stories that I've mentioned. So when it comes to our families, who says what typical really is? Sometimes we let others' definitions or views of what's normal shape our own views of our own family. But like we said last week, no matter what kind of family you come from, no family is typical. Your family is already atypical, but what if God is calling your family to be even more atypical than it already is? Every family has imperfections, problems, and struggles that they're dealing with. But typical families often try to handle those problems themselves. They tell themselves, hey, we've got this. We're the ones that are in this situation and we're going to get ourselves out of it. But oftentimes they end up not handling the problem at all. Atypical families, on the other hand, invite God into their problems. Atypical families say, God, we are a messed up family. We are in a messed up situation. And God, we need your help right now. Last week we said that no family is too simple or too complex for God to use. And your family can be used by God to do atypical things in this world. But how? At some point, every family experiences difficulty or conflict. You might be experiencing one of those situations right now. You might be going through something in your family that if you told the rest of us what was going on, we wouldn't believe it. And like I said, typical families may try to handle those situations on their own. They try to bottle that up. They try to tell the world that everything's okay. They just ignore the problem. But atypical families ask for God's help. They realize that they can't handle this problem on their own, and they are seeking out to God, saying, God, please come help us. Last week we met a family, the family of Adam and Eve, the world's very first family. And we saw how their story went from very wrong as a result of their choices to disobey God to a story of redemption. Because of God's grace and through His love, God used the family of Adam and Eve and their line to bring about Jesus and His salvation to us. So today I want to introduce you to another family, another atypical family in the Bible. It's a family that lived many generations after after Adam and Eve. And it's the story of Abraham and his family. You've probably heard this story before of Abraham and his wife Sarah. And he's an important person in our history and our faith because of the important promise that God made to Abraham, the promise that He would make him the father of many nations. And that's exactly what He did. And God kept that promise and fulfilled that promise all the way up to today. So let's learn more about Abraham's life and specifically his relationship with his nephew Lot. And when we read in Genesis chapter 13, we learn about Abraham and Lot. Abraham was traveling with his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot. They began to argue. Abraham and Lot began to argue over the fact that where they were, they had too much cattle. They had too many herds for where they were. And they began to argue about the fact that they didn't have enough space for all of these cattle. And Abraham decided he would give Lot the choice of what land to take. He said, you look to the east, and if you go to the east, I'll go to the west. And if you look to the west and you want the west, I'll go to the east. He gave Lot the choice. And Lot looked at the land and saw that one direction had far greater opportunity for his herds, for his cattle, and he chose that way. And Abraham chose the other way. The land that Lot chose to be best for his herds was also the land that was filled with the most sin. It was the land near the town of Sodom. We know about the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. Abraham and Lot were like many of our families today. They fought. They had disagreements. They didn't get along. In fact, they fought so much that it came to a point where they knew that if they didn't separate, it was going to be bad. It was going to be a terrible situation within their family. And I'm sure you've never done that before, right? You've never been so angry with your family that you just wanted to move away, that you just wanted to get away from your entire family. That's never happened, right? I didn't think so. Maybe you just thought you did. And we'll get back to the story of Lot in a little bit, but I want you to take a little bit more time and talk about Abraham so that we can understand how atypical his family really was. So we're going to read in Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15, and we're going to look at Abraham and his story with his wife Sarah. So Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15.
The Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you've honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey." "All right," they said, "do as you have said." So Abraham ran back to the tent and said to Sarah, "Hurry, get 3 large measures of your best flour, knead it into dough, and bake some bread." Then Abraham ran out to the herd and chose a tender calf and gave it to his servant, who quickly prepared it. When the food was ready, Abraham took some yogurt and milk and the roasted meat, and he served it to the men. As they ate, Abraham waited on them in the shade of the trees. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the visitor asked. "She's inside the tent," Abraham replied. Then one of them said, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son." Sarah was listening to this conversation from the tent. Abraham and Sarah were both very old by this time, and Sarah was long past the age of having children. So she laughed silently to herself and said, "How could a worn-out woman like me enjoy such pleasure, especially my master? My husband is also so old." Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, 'Can an old woman like me have a baby?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she denied it, saying, "I didn't laugh." But the Lord said, "No, you did laugh." Genesis 18, 1 through 15.
So now that we've read that passage, Abraham and Sarah were really, really old. And they didn't have any kids, but they were visited by messengers from God. And they told them that Sarah was going to have a baby. Now let me put this in perspective. If your grandmother went around trying and telling everybody that she was going to have a baby, what would you think about your grandmother's mental state? Yeah, that's right. You'd think she was crazy. And that's what a lot of people in this time period, in this story, thought. They're like, there's no way Sarah's fixing to have a baby. She is too old. She is, over the hill. She's past childbearing age. She's not going to have a child. But she did. And that's how atypical Abraham's family was. So now let's look back at Abraham and Lot. Abraham and Lot had a long history of disagreements. Remember, they fought so much that they had to separate from each other. They had to live in totally different cities just so that they didn't hurt their relationship anymore. But when Abraham learned that God was going to destroy the city of Sodom where Lot lived, Abraham made a choice. He pleaded with God on Lot's behalf, and in response to Abraham's prayer, Lot and his family were saved. I want to read Genesis chapter 18, verses 22 through 33. The men turned from there and went toward Sodom while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Abraham stepped forward and said, Will you really sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away instead of sparing the place for the sake of 50 righteous people who are in it? You could not possibly do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. You could not possibly do that. Won't the judge of the whole earth do what is just? The Lord said, If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their risk. Then Abraham answered, Since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, even though I am dust and ashes, suppose the 50 righteous lack 5. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? He replied, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Then he spoke to him again. Suppose 40 were there. He answered, I will not do it on account of 40. Then he said, Let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak further. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30. Then he said, Since I have ventured to speak to my Lord, suppose 20 are found there. He replied, I will not destroy it on account of 20. Then he said, Let my Lord not be angry, and I will speak one more time. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, I will not destroy it on account of 10. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he departed, and Abraham returned to his place. Now, Abraham did something that we might find kind of unusual. He pleaded with God and said, God, if there's 50, will you not destroy this city? God, if there's 45, if there's 40, if there's 30, 20, God, if there's just 10 righteous men in this city, will you still destroy it? And each time God said, no, I won't destroy it. God gave the city of Sodom time and time, multiple chances to not destroy this city if there were just 10 righteous men in the town. And after Abraham had pleaded with God not to destroy the city and bargained with God to find just 10 righteous men to save it, God's angels entered the city and did not find any righteous men. And then we look at Genesis chapter 19, verses 27 and 29, and it tells us that the angels removed Lot and his family before the destruction because of Abraham's faithfulness. Not because of Lot's faithfulness, but because of Abraham's faithfulness. Let me read this for you. Genesis chapter 19, verses 27 through 29. Early in the morning, Abraham went to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, and he saw that smoke was going up from the land, like the smoke of the furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham and brought Lot out of the middle of the upheaval when he demolished the cities where Lot had lived. Now, last week we said that if God can use your family to do atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something that's atypical. We talked about the fact that if your family, if you're the only one that goes to church, sometimes you have to be the one to step out and do that atypical thing and lead your family to the Lord. And that's what Abraham did here. When you're fighting with someone in your family, the typical response is to fight back, to hold a grudge, to continue to argue, or maybe you just do the silent treatment. But Abraham did the atypical thing with his family, with his nephew Lot. He prayed for Lot. He begged God to save this city, but he also prayed for Lot in the middle of this conflict. He didn't wait for Lot to apologize to him. He didn't wait for reconciliation. He led out in prayer. And this might seem simple, but it's very, very atypical for us today because we want to be right. And we want others to know that we're right. Not so typical families pray for each other. They don't wait for each other for somebody else to give in. Atypical families are the first ones to let God in and ask God for help. And just like Abraham saw that prayer changed his family for the better, prayer can change your family for the better as well. Every family has imperfections and problems and struggles, but atypical families invite God into those problems. Prayer doesn't have to be complicated. It could be simple as thanking God for your family. Even when you're not sure you want to thank God for your family. Prayer can be as simple as asking God to give you love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and self-control. Prayer can be asking God to give you the wisdom to resolve this conflict. Prayer can be as simple as asking God to help someone else, another family member that you're fighting with, to resolve this conflict. And again, it can be thanking God for helping your family through this transition, through these trials. Think right now about a recent disagreement that you had with a family member. It could be a parent or a sibling or a cousin or whoever it may be. And think about how that started. Think about how that disagreement, that argument progressed over time. Now imagine how that conflict could be transformed if you stopped to pray with each other instead of fighting. How do you think prayer could change your attitude, your temper, your perspective in the middle of this disagreement? How do you think prayer could change the other person's attitude, their temper, their perspective when you're fighting? How do you think prayer could begin to change your family's pattern of behavior in the long term? Prayer is an important part of our life, and we've got to remember that when it comes to disagreements with our family. We've got to start there. When we have disagreements, we need to start with prayer. Notice that you can't just pray that the other person would change. Notice that we have to pray that we will both change. Sometimes we've got to change that our attitude will change first. It's interesting that Abraham chose to pray for Lot even before they were reconciled. And in the middle of their conflict, Abraham went first and chose to pray for Lot instead of continuing to fight with him. So this week, what if you decided to go first? Right now, I want you to think of one family member that you've had a major disagreement with over this past week, maybe within the last 24 hours. And I want you to pray for that person. I want you to pray for that situation. I want you to pray that God would come into that situation and resolve that situation. Maybe it's a situation where you need your heart changed in order for the situation to be resolved. Whatever it is, think of that one disagreement that you've had this week and pray about that right now. Because when disagreements happen, typical families, they scream, they fight, they hold grudges, they struggle with this idea of common ground. But not so typical families pray for each other. They pray with each other. They pray that the problems that they're going through will be resolved. They pray that their hearts would be changed. They pray that their families' hearts would be changed. So if you commit to praying for your family more than you fight with them, imagine how God would be able to use your atypical family. Imagine how others looking on the outside in would be able to look at your family differently and say, hey, something's different about this family. And I want to know what it is. So I want to close us in prayer, and I want to ask that you just continue to pray for you and your family in this time. Heavenly Father, I thank you for all that you do, and I pray that you would just be with these families right now. I pray that you would just watch over them and guide them. And God, if there's any issues with these families, Lord, I know that there is. But God, if there are issues right now, I pray that they would call on you. I pray that they would be an atypical family and call on you. They don't try to be the typical family and handle these problems on their own, but they call on you. God, I pray that if there's a student watching this that knows that their family is struggling, I pray that they would be the one to lead out in this prayer time for you to resolve this family situation. God, if there's a parent watching this right now and they know that their family is struggling in areas and they're fighting, I pray that they would be the ones to lead out and be the godly parent that you've called them to be. God, whatever the situation, I pray for atypical families to call out to you and that you would be with them and help them resolve these situations in their family life. Lord, don't let them think that they can do it on their own. God, I thank you for all that you do, and I pray that you just continue to bless us in all that we do. It's in your name I pray. Amen. We look forward to being back with you again in person as soon as possible. But until then, we're going to continue to put out these videos, and we're going to continue to do things in an atypical way, I guess you could say. So keep an eye out for our next video, and I'll be praying for you and your family as well.